David Carter moved carefully through the thick jungle, his boots sinking into the damp earth with every step. The planet Varek 7 was nothing like Earth. The trees here were taller than skyscrapers, their leaves glowing faintly under the twin moons above. Strange animal sounds filled the night, some soft, some sharp, but all unfamiliar. David had spent months exploring this jungle, collecting plant samples and mapping the terrain for the Terran exploration course. Tonight, however, something felt different. As he secured his small campsite near a flowing river, he heard a sound that sent chills down his spine. A scream. It was distant, but not so far that he could ignore it. It didn't belong to any creature he had heard before. It was sharp, desperate, and unmistakably human-like. David froze, his heart pounding. No way, he muttered to himself. As far as he knew, no other humans were supposed to be here. The jungle was dangerous, filled with predatory creatures and hidden traps left by past alien civilizations. If someone was out there, they were in trouble. He grabbed his pulse torch and his survival knife, quickly stuffing a medkit into his backpack. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he couldn't ignore the scream. The sound came again, slightly weaker this time. Without hesitation, David moved, his instincts guiding him through the dark jungle. A terrifying discovery. The jungle was alive at night. Strange glowing insects buzzed past his face. Massive vine-like roots slithered under the soil, reacting to his footsteps. He had learned to respect this place. One wrong step, and the jungle itself could swallow you whole. As he pushed forward, he heard rustling ahead. Something was struggling, caught in something. David crouched low, hiding behind the thick foliage. He peered through the darkness and saw something that made his breath catch. It was a woman, but not human. She was trapped in a metallic hunting snare, her body twisted in pain. Her skin was a deep emerald green, marked with faint silver lines that pulsed like veins filled with light. Her eyes, barely open, glowed like liquid silver. She had sharp, delicate features, and her long hair, the color of dark violets, hung loosely over her shoulders. She was alien, but she was suffering. Her legs and arms were bound tightly, and the snare seemed to be draining her strength. Small metallic spikes had pierced into her skin, sending tiny electric pulses through her body. It was designed to keep its prey weak and immobilized. David clenched his jaw. This wasn't a natural trap. Someone set this intentionally, and whoever did it could still be nearby. The alien woman whimpered, her voice weak. She tried to pull herself free, but the more she struggled, the tighter the trap squeezed. David made a decision, breaking the trap. Moving swiftly, he stepped out from his hiding place and approached the woman. Her silver eyes snapped open in alarm. She hissed weakly, her body tensing. "Easy," David said, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not here to hurt you." She didn't understand his words, but his calm tone seemed to reach her. She blinked slowly, her breathing heavy. David studied the trap. It was advanced, far beyond what simple hunters would use. The locking mechanism had a small energy core, likely keeping the restraints powered. He had never seen anything like it before. "I need to cut you out of this," he said, more to himself than her. "This might sting." Carefully, he pulled out his survival knife and started cutting through the thick wires. Sparks flew as he severed one of the main connectors. The trap shuddered but didn't release. The alien woman gasped in pain, her body convulsing slightly. "Damn it," David muttered. He worked faster. He spotted a small control panel on the side of the trap. If he could disable the power source, it might deactivate the restraints. With steady hands, he pulled out his multi-tool and unscrewed the panel. Inside, he found a power crystal glowing faintly. This must be it, he thought. With a sharp twist, he yanked the crystal free. Instantly, the trap powered down, and the metal bindings released their hold. The alien woman collapsed forward, falling into David's arms. The warning. She was weak, but her breathing was steady. Up close, David could see the faint scars on her arms. She had been hunted before. She slowly looked up at him, her silver eyes full of exhaustion and confusion. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice accented and heavy with fatigue. "David," he said simply. She tried to sit up, but her body shook violently. He steadied her, gently lowering her to the ground. "Don't move yet," he said. "You need to rest." But she grabbed his arm tightly, her fingers trembling. Her eyes widened with fear. "You don't understand," she rasped. They will come back." David's stomach dropped. "They?" As if on cue, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the jungle. Something was approaching. David turned his head toward the darkness. The hunters had found them. David's muscles tensed as he heard the distant rumbling sound. It wasn't a natural jungle noise. It was deep, mechanical, and growing louder by the second. The alien woman, still weak, gripped his arm tightly. Her silver eyes were filled with fear. "They are coming," she whispered, struggling to sit up. David glanced around. The jungle was dense, but if these hunters had technology advanced enough to set that kind of trap, they probably had tracking devices as well. He had to move, fast. "Can you walk?" he asked urgently. She shook her head, her body trembling from exhaustion. David clenched his jaw. He didn't have time to think. Without another word, he lifted her into his arms, careful not to hurt her further. She gasped softly at the sudden movement, but didn't resist. Then he ran. The jungle chase. The jungle was alive with movement. David could hear something large moving through the trees behind him. Heavy footsteps. Not human. Through the gaps in the trees, he caught glimpses of dark figures moving swiftly, their eyes glowing red in the shadows. The hunters. David pushed forward, jumping over thick roots and dodging low-hanging vines. The alien woman clung weakly to his shoulders, her breath shallow. The ground suddenly shook, and a sharp blast of energy tore through the air, hitting a nearby tree. The trunk exploded into splinters, nearly knocking David off balance. "Damn it," he cursed, realizing the hunters weren't just tracking them. They were shooting at them. The thick jungle canopy made it difficult for the hunters to get a clear shot, but that wouldn't last forever. David spotted a rocky incline up ahead. If he could make it there, he might be able to lose them in the cliffs. "Hold on," he said. The alien woman nodded weakly, her silver eyes fluttering open just long enough to look at him. "You should leave me," she whispered. "They want me, not you." David gritted his teeth. "Not happening," he said. She didn't argue. A desperate escape. Reaching the incline, David leaped onto the rocks, using every bit of strength to climb upward while carrying her. His muscles burned, but he refused to stop. A loud screech echoed from below. The hunters had reached the clearing, and now they saw him clearly. David stole a quick glance back. There were 3 of them, large, armored figures with insect-like exoskeletons and glowing red visors. Their energy rifles crackled as they aimed. One of them raised its weapon. No time. David grabbed a loose rock from the cliffside and hurled it downward with all his strength. It struck one of the hunters in the helmet, knocking them off balance. The moment of distraction was all he needed. He pulled himself and the alien woman over the ledge, disappearing into the thick underbrush. For a few seconds, there was silence. Then, a deep growl came from below. The hunters were not happy. A moment to breathe. David didn't stop running until he was deep inside a hidden cave, surrounded by thick vines that concealed the entrance. He lowered the alien woman gently onto the cool ground. His chest rose and fell heavily as he caught his breath. His hands trembled from the adrenaline rush. The alien woman looked up at him, her breathing labored. You saved me," she whispered. David let out a tired chuckle, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Yeah, well, no point letting you die after all that trouble." She blinked, surprised at his words. For a moment, there was silence between them. The jungle outside was still, except for the distant hum of the hunters searching for them. Then she spoke again. "My name is Lurvea." David nodded, his breathing slowing. "David." She studied him, her silver eyes full of curiosity and something else. Admiration. "You are human?" she asked. David nodded again. "Yeah. Last I checked." Lurvea hesitated, then said softly, "I have never seen a human before, but I heard stories. Good ones, I hope," David joked. Lurvea didn't laugh. Instead, her expression grew serious. "The hunters, they are called the Dravaks. They do not just hunt for sport. They take people and sell them." David's expression hardened. "So they were hunting you, to sell you." She nodded slowly. "And now, they will hunt you too." David exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "Great, so I just made things worse for myself." Lurvea looked down. "I am sorry, you should not have helped me." David frowned. "Yeah, well," he said, adjusting his gear, "I don't really like the idea of leaving people to die in cages." Lurvea looked at him for a long moment, as if studying him in a new light. "You are different from what I expected," she murmured. David sighed. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The next step. The cave was safe, for now. But the Dravaks weren't going to stop. David needed a plan. "Do you have anywhere safe to go?" he asked. Lurvea hesitated. "There is a hidden outpost. My people, they might be there." David nodded. "Good, then that's where we're going." Lurvea's eyes widened. "You are coming with me." David grinned tiredly. "Well, I figure I already made enemies with these guys. Might as well finish what I started." For the first time, Lurvea smiled. But outside the cave, in the dark jungle, the Dravaks were still searching, and they were getting closer. David sat against the rough cave wall, his breath steadying as he listened carefully to the sounds outside. The jungle was eerily silent, too silent. That meant one thing. The Dravaks were still out there, searching. Lurvea sat a few feet away, her body still weak but recovering. She watched him closely, silver eyes flickering with curiosity and something else. Concern. "You are thinking of fighting them," she said softly. David let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Fighting them? No. Surviving them. Yes." Lurvea lowered her gaze. "They will not stop. Not until they find us." David looked at her. "You said there's an outpost where your people might be, right?" She nodded. "It is far, beyond the mountain ridge, but I do not know if it is still there." David thought for a moment. "Then we take the chance. Sitting here is just waiting for them to find us." Lurvea hesitated. "But you do not need to help me. You could escape alone." David met her gaze and smiled slightly. "Yeah, but I'm not the kind of guy who leaves someone behind." Lurvea's silver eyes softened. She had never met a human before, but the stories she had heard always described them as unpredictable. Now she understood why. Suddenly, a strange clicking sound echoed from the jungle outside. Lurvea tensed immediately. "They are close." David grabbed his survival knife and carefully moved toward the cave entrance, peering through the vines. Through the gaps, he saw 3 Dravaks, slowly moving through the jungle. Their armor was dark, blending with the shadows. Their red visors glowed, scanning the area. One of them stopped and crouched down, touching the ground where David's footprints had been. "They're tracking us," David whispered. Lurvea's breath hitched. "If they find us here, we will not escape." David's mind raced. They needed to move now. He turned back to her. "Can you walk?" She nodded, but he could tell she was still weak. "All right, stay close to me. We'll slip out the back and move toward the mountains." Lurvea swallowed hard and forced herself up, leaning slightly against the cave wall. David helped her steady herself, then motioned for her to follow. A dangerous path. Carefully, They moved toward the opposite side of the cave, where a narrow passage led out into a denser part of the jungle. David made sure to step lightly, avoiding dry leaves or loose rocks that could make noise. Lurvea followed, her breathing shallow but determined. Behind them, the Dravhaks were getting closer. David could hear their voices in a strange alien language, their footsteps crushing the jungle floor. His grip tightened on his knife. If they got caught, he wasn't sure how long he could fight them off. Finally, they'd reached the other side of the cave and slipped into the thick jungle. Lurvea gasped quietly. They are too close. David scanned the area. The mountain ridge was still far, but there was a way to slow the hunters down. He pointed to a twisted tree with thick vines. We climb. Lurvea's eyes widened. Climb? David smirked. Trust me. Without waiting, he grabbed a vine and pulled himself up, moving swiftly. Lurvea hesitated only for a second before following, her movements agile despite her weakness. Just as they disappeared into the treetops, the Dravhak stepped into the clearing below. David and Lurvea held their breath. The hunters paused, scanning the ground. One of them bent down, running a clawed hand through the dirt. Then one of them growled something in their language. A moment later, they split up, heading in different directions. David let out a silent sigh of relief. We bought some time, he whispered. Lurvea looked down, her expression tense. But not much. David nodded. Then let's keep moving. Nightfall in the jungle. Hours passed as they moved through the treetops, carefully navigating the network of thick branches and vines. Lurvea was clearly struggling, but she refused to slow down. David glanced at her. You okay? She nodded, though her face was pale. I will be. Eventually, they reached a hidden clearing where a small waterfall trickled over the rocks. David helped Lurvea down, and she collapsed near the water, breathing hard. We can rest here for a bit, he said. She nodded weakly, drinking from the cool water. David sat beside her, his eyes scanning the dark jungle. The Dravhaks were still searching, but for now, they were ahead. Lurvea finally spoke. You are strong for a human. David chuckled. Well, I have my moments. She smiled slightly but then grew serious. They will keep hunting us. They are relentless. David leaned back, looking up at the alien sky. Then we just have to be smarter. Lurvea studied him. Why are you helping me? You could have left. David met her gaze. Because I don't like the idea of people being hunted like animals. She blinked, surprised by his words. Then she whispered, maybe the stories were wrong about humans. David smirked, or maybe they just didn't know the right ones. They both sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sound of the waterfall. But far in the distance, a loud howl echoed through the jungle. David's expression darkened. They found our trail again. Lurvea slowly stood, her strength returning. Then we keep moving. David nodded, gripping his knife. They weren't out of danger yet. David's grip tightened around his survival knife as the distant howl echoed through the jungle. It was a terrifying sound, low, guttural, and filled with hunger. Lurvea's silver eyes flickered with concern. They have found our trail again. David nodded. Yeah. And they sound closer this time. The jungle around them was dark and dense, the towering trees blocking most of the moonlight. The only illumination came from the faint glow of bioluminescent plants and the soft trickle of the small waterfall nearby. Lurvea took a deep breath, steadying herself. We must move quickly. David looked at her. She was still weak from the trap, but there was determination in her eyes. Think you can keep up? He asked. Lurvea gave a small nod. I will not slow you down. David smirked. Good, because I don't plan on getting caught. They moved fast, pushing deeper into the jungle, stepping carefully to avoid breaking branches or making unnecessary noise. The Dravhaks were still searching, but this time they weren't alone. Shadows in the jungle. The howl came again, closer now, followed by heavy movement. Something large was moving through the underbrush. David motioned for Lurvea to stop, pressing a finger to his lips. She understood immediately and crouched low behind a thick tree. David peered through the darkness. At first, he saw nothing. But then, a shadow moved just beyond the trees. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with thick, armored limbs and glowing red eyes that cut through the darkness. David's heartbeat quickened. "That's not a Dravhak," he whispered. Lurvea's breath caught in her throat. "No, it is one of their hunting beasts." David frowned. "Great, they brought a pet." The creature sniffed the air, its head turning sharply in their direction. David knew what was coming next. "Run," he whispered urgently. "The chase begins." They took off through the jungle, their footsteps silent but swift. Behind them, the hunting beast let out a deep snarl, then charged forward, smashing through trees like they were nothing. David didn't look back. He didn't need to. He could hear the beast's massive footsteps thundering behind them, crushing everything in its path. Lurvea struggled to keep up, her body still weak, but she pushed forward, determined not to fall behind. "We won't outrun it," she gasped. David knew she was right. The beast was faster and stronger. They needed another plan. Then he saw it, a massive tree with hanging vines, leading to a high rocky ledge above. "This way," David yelled, grabbing a vine. He swung upward, pulling himself onto a thick branch. Lurvea followed, using her agility to climb quickly. Below them, the beast skidded to a stop, its red eyes scanning the area. It growled, sniffing the air, trying to track their movement. David watched carefully. If it couldn't see them, maybe it would move on. But then, the Dravhaks arrived. 3 of them stepped into the clearing, their red visors glowing in the darkness. One of them spoke in their harsh, alien tongue, motioning toward the ground. David felt his chest tighten. "They're telling it to keep searching," Lurvea whispered. David's mind raced. They needed to get out of here, fast. Then, an idea formed. He leaned toward Lurvea and whispered, "I need you to trust me." She blinked, confused but nodded. "What are you planning?" David smirked. "Just a little trick I learned back on Earth." He reached into his belt pouch and pulled out a small flare stick. Carefully, he activated it, then tossed it far to the left, into a dense thicket. The flare exploded in bright red light, hissing and sparking. Immediately, the beast roared, turning toward the noise. The Dravhaks snapped their heads toward the sudden light, their weapons raised. "This is our chance," David whispered. Without waiting, they moved swiftly across the branches, staying hidden as they escaped toward the cliffs. The narrow escape. The jungle thinned as they reached the base of the mountain ridge. David could see the rocky path leading upward. It was steep but climbable. "We're almost there," he said. Lurvea staggered slightly, exhaustion creeping back into her body. David caught her arm. "I got you," he said firmly. She looked at him, surprised by his unwavering determination. Together, they began climbing, using rocks and vines for support. Below them, the Dravhaks were still searching in the jungle, unaware that their prey was escaping right above them. After several grueling minutes, they reached a small plateau overlooking the jungle. David pulled Lurvea up and collapsed against the rocks, catching his breath. She sat beside him, her chest rising and falling heavily. "You did it," she murmured. David chuckled. "Yeah. Let's hope we can keep it up." Lurvea turned toward him. "You are unlike any warrior I have ever known." David smirked. "That's because I'm not a warrior." She shook her head. "No, but you fight, and you never abandon those in need." David exhaled and looked at the dark jungle below. They had escaped for now, but the Dravhaks wouldn't give up. He turned to Lurvea. "We need to find that outpost." She nodded, her expression serious. "Then we move at first light." David leaned back, staring at the alien stars above. This was far from over. David sat against the cold rock, staring down at the jungle below. The Dravaks were still searching, their red visors glowing like tiny fireflies in the darkness. Lurvea sat beside him, breathing heavily. She was exhausted, but her eyes remained sharp and alert. "We cannot stay here long," she whispered. David nodded. "Agreed. At first light, we move." She hesitated before speaking. "You have risked much for me, human. I will not forget this." David smirked. "You're not so bad yourself." Lurvea blinked at him, confused by his casual tone, but she said nothing. The jungle below remained alive with movement, but for now, they were safe. Dawn breaks. As the first rays of sunlight peeked over the mountain ridge, David and Lurvea prepared to leave. Lurvea stretched her aching limbs, testing her strength. She was still weak, but she refused to slow down. David handed her a small piece of dried ration from his supply pack. "Not the best breakfast, but it'll help." She took it hesitantly and chewed. "This tastes like dust." David chuckled. "Yeah, but it keeps you going." Lurvea sighed but finished eating. "Humans eat strange things." David grinned. "And yet, you survived." She shook her head but smiled slightly. Then the ground trembled slightly. David's grin faded. He turned his head, listening. What was that? Lurvea tensed. "They are getting closer." David scanned the jungle below and cursed under his breath. "They found our tracks," he muttered. Lurvea's eyes darkened. "Then we must move. Now." The hidden passage. Lurvea led David along the rocky cliffs, following a narrow, winding path that hugged the side of the mountain. "This way," she said, pointing to a small crevice hidden behind thick vines. David peered inside. The passage was tight and dark, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "You sure about this?" he asked. Lurvea nodded. "It is an old escape route. It will lead us to the other side of the ridge." David sighed. "All right. After you." Lurvea slid through the narrow opening first. David followed, squeezing through the rocky passage. The tunnel was cold and damp, the air filled with the smell of wet stone and moss. David kept his knife ready. "How long is this tunnel?" Lurvea's voice echoed softly. "Not long, but it is not safe." David frowned. "Define not safe." Before she could answer, a strange growling sound echoed from the depths of the tunnel. David froze. "Tell me that was your stomach." Lurvea's expression hardened. "No." David sighed. "Yeah, didn't think so." The underground threat. The growling grew louder, followed by scratching sounds on the stone walls. David gripped his knife tighter. "Whatever that is, it's coming closer." Lurvea reached for a small metal device in her belt. A faint blue light glowed from its surface. "What is that?" David whispered. She kept her eyes ahead. "A sonic disruptor. It will only work once." David exhaled. "Then let's make it count." From the darkness ahead, something moved. A shadow lunged forward, its shape twisted and unnatural. Its eyes glowed dimly, and its clawed limbs scraped against the tunnel walls. David barely had time to react before it attacked. The fight in the dark. The creature swung its claws, but David dodged, rolling to the side as stone fragments rained down. Lurvea raised the sonic disruptor, but before she could activate it, the creature charged her. David acted fast. He grabbed a loose rock and slammed it into the creature's head. The beast howled in rage, staggering back. Lurvea took her chance. She pressed the disruptor's trigger, and a high-pitched pulse filled the tunnel. The creature shrieked, its body convulsing before it collapsed onto the ground. David breathed heavily. That was unpleasant. Lurvea nodded, her body shaking slightly. "We must move before more come." David didn't argue. He grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. Together, they raced through the tunnel, not stopping until they saw light ahead. A new danger. They emerged from the passage, stepping onto a high plateau overlooking a vast valley. David shielded his eyes from the bright sun. Well, that was fun. Lurvea didn't respond. Her gaze was locked onto the valley below. David followed her line of sight. Then his stomach dropped. A Dravak camp was spread out in the valley, filled with ships, weapons, and cages holding captured aliens. Lurvea's hands clenched into fists. They are taking prisoners. David exhaled sharply. Looks like we just found trouble. She turned to him, her silver eyes filled with determination. We must help them. David looked at the heavily armed camp, then back at her. He sighed, shaking his head with a small grin. You're really gonna get me killed, aren't you? Lurvea smiled slightly. You said you do not leave people behind. David smirked. Yeah. Let's figure out a plan. Far below, the Dravhaks continued their work, unaware that two determined fugitives were now watching them from above. David crouched behind a large rock, scanning the Dravhak camp below. The alien hunters were well armed and organized, moving around their ships and cages, watching their prisoners closely. Lurvea knelt beside him, her silver eyes filled with anger and sorrow. They have taken many, she whispered. David exhaled. Yeah. And they're not treating them nicely either. The cages were cramped, filled with aliens of different species, all looking weak and defeated. Some of them were injured, others barely moving. David's jaw tightened. He had seen this kind of cruelty before, but he never got used to it. Lurvea turned to him. We must free them. David glanced at her. You do realize there are at least 20 Dravhaks down there, and we're just 2 people. Lurvea didn't back down. If we do nothing, they will be sold, or worse. David sighed, rubbing his face. He knew she was right. He hated leaving people behind. All right, he said finally. We'll do it. Lurvea's expression softened. Thank you. David smirked. Yeah. Let's just figure out how we don't die in the process. Studying the enemy. They watched the camp closely, looking for weaknesses. David pointed to a small generator unit near the center. That thing's running their cage locks and security systems. If we disable it, the prisoners can escape. Lurvea nodded. And the weapons? David spotted a supply tent near the edge of the camp, where Dravhak soldiers were stacking crates of energy rifles and explosives. If we take out their weapons, David said, they'll have a harder time stopping the prisoners. Lurvea considered this. Then we create a distraction first. David grinned. Now you're thinking like a human. Lurvea smirked. And you, like a warrior. David shook his head. Let's just call it survival. The infiltration begins. As night fell, David and Lurvea moved silently through the shadows. David made his way toward the supply tent, staying low. A Dravhak guard stood nearby, watching the area lazily. David grabbed a small rock and threw it into the jungle. The guard turned, confused. David struck fast, wrapping his arm around the alien's neck and pulling him down without a sound. The Dravhak struggled for a second, then went limp. David dragged the unconscious body behind a crate, then signaled Lurvea. She nodded and slipped toward the generator. David opened one of the crates and grinned. Explosives. Perfect. He set the charges, making sure they would go off right after the prisoners were freed. Now, it was up to Lurvea. The power cut. Lurvea reached the generator unit without being seen. She pulled out her sonic disruptor and placed it against the control panel. Goodbye, power. She activated the device, and the generator sparked wildly, shutting down. Immediately, the cage doors began unlocking. The prisoners looked up in shock, realizing they were free. Then, chaos broke loose. The battle erupts. An alarm blared, and the Dravhaks rushed into action, shouting orders. David hit the detonator. The supply tent exploded, sending crates and weapons flying. A wave of fire and smoke spread through the camp, blinding the guards. The prisoners saw their chance and charged their captors, using their fists, claws, and anything they could find to fight back. David rushed forward, grabbing a fallen energy rifle and taking cover behind a crate. Lurvea dodged incoming fire, moving gracefully through the battle, knocking down Dravhaks with precise, swift strikes. The camp descended into complete chaos. David versus Korgath. David was about to fire at another guard when a massive shadow loomed over him. He barely had time to react before he was lifted off the ground and slammed into a crate. Pain shot through his body as he looked up. A towering Dravhak stood over him, its armor thicker than the others. Its glowing red eyes stared at him coldly. "You are the human," it growled. David coughed. "Yeah, and you must be the ugly boss." The Dravhak leader, Korgath, snarled. "You ruined my hunt. I will crush you." David grinned, despite the pain. "Try it." Korgath lunged, but David rolled aside, grabbing a broken metal pipe and swinging it hard against the alien's head. The Dravhak staggered, surprised by the impact. David took the chance and kicked him backward, grabbing a fallen blaster rifle. Korgath snarled, his claws glowing with energy. "You are strong, for a human." David smirked. "Yeah, I get that a lot." The two charged at each other. Victory and escape. While David fought Korgath, Lurvea and the prisoners overpowered the remaining Dravhaks. The battle was turning in their favor. Lurvea grabbed a weapon from the ground and aimed at the last Dravhak soldier, forcing him to drop his gun. "Run," she commanded. The Dravhak hesitated, then fled into the jungle, disappearing into the night. Meanwhile, David and Korgath's fight reached its climax. David dodged a final swipe, then slammed his blaster against Korgath's head. The Dravhak leader fell hard, groaning in defeat. David stood over him, panting. "Guess the hunt's over." Lurvea ran up to him. "We must go. More will come." David nodded, looking at the freed prisoners. "Everyone, move out." They rushed into the jungle, leaving the burning camp behind. For the first time, Lurvea smiled. "You did it," she said. David chuckled. "We did it." But deep in the jungle, something else watched them from the shadows. The real danger was still ahead. David and Lurvea led the freed prisoners deeper into the jungle. The group moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the thick undergrowth. The sounds of the burning Dravhak camp faded behind them, but the tension didn't ease. Every time a branch snapped or a bird squawked overhead, the group froze, eyes darting in every direction. They knew the hunters wouldn't give up so easily. "We need to rest," one of the prisoners, a slender alien with teal skin, finally said. His voice was trembling. David glanced at him, then at the others. Most of them were in rough shape, wounded, weak, and clearly exhausted. He nodded. "All right, we'll stop for a while." Lurvea led them to a small clearing hidden by thick foliage. It was far enough off the main path that it would be hard for the Dravhaks to find them right away. David helped the prisoners settle down. Some sat on fallen logs, while others leaned against the wide tree trunks, grateful for even a moment's peace. Lurvea crouched beside David. "They are weak. They cannot continue like this." David sighed. "I know, but we can't stay here long. If the Dravhaks regroup, they'll track us again." Lurvea's silver eyes studied him. "You have done much already, human. You do not owe them more." David met her gaze. "If I leave them now, what's the point of freeing them in the first place?" Lurvea paused, then gave him a small nod. "You are different from what I have heard of your kind." David smirked. "I'll take that as a compliment." A warning from the shadows. As the group rested, David moved to the edge of the clearing, scanning the jungle. He was watching for any sign of movement, any glow of red visors, or the telltale sound of approaching footsteps. That's when he heard a voice, soft and low. "Human." David's heart skipped. He spun around, knife in hand, but saw nothing. "Who's there?" he whispered sharply. Lurvea was at his side in an instant, her own weapon drawn. "What is it?" "Someone's out there," David said, scanning the shadows. The voice came again, this time clearer. "You should not have come here." David narrowed his eyes. "Show yourself." The leaves rustled, and a figure stepped forward. It was a tall, cloaked alien, their face obscured by a hood. Their voice was deep and resonant, but they didn't appear hostile. Lurvea's breath caught. "You are Varen." The figure nodded. "I am." David relaxed slightly, though he kept his guard up. "If you're Varen, why were you hiding?" The alien glanced at the group of prisoners. "I have been watching the Dravaks for some time. They do not know I am here, and I intend to keep it that way." Lurvea stepped forward. "You saw what they did to our people. Why didn't you help?" The hooded figure lowered their head. "Because there are more than just the Dravaks." David frowned. "What do you mean?" The alien looked directly at him, their eyes glowing faintly under the hood. "The Dravaks are not the true enemy. They are pawns of a greater force, one that seeks to destroy all resistance." Lurvea's eyes widened. "You speak of the Council of Orcs." The figure nodded gravely. "They are the ones funding these hunts. The Dravaks are just tools to them. And now that you have freed these prisoners, you have drawn their attention." David clenched his fists. "You're saying we're in deeper trouble than we thought?" "Yes," the alien said. "But there is still hope. I can guide you to a safe place, where the Avox's reach does not extend." Lurvea looked at David. "We cannot fight the Avox alone. If this Varen knows of a safe haven, we must go." David exhaled. He didn't trust this cloaked stranger, but they had little choice. "Fine," David said. "Lead the way." The journey to Sanctuary. The hooded alien led them through the jungle, moving swiftly and confidently. They seemed to know every twist and turn, every hidden path. The group followed closely, the prisoners whispering among themselves. David overheard fragments of their conversations, mentions of family members lost, homes destroyed, and friends taken by the hunters. Lurvea walked beside him, her expression tense. "Do you believe this, Varen?" David asked quietly. "I do not know," she admitted, "but if there is even a chance they speak the truth, we must follow." David nodded. "Fair enough." The ancient refuge. After hours of trekking, they reached a hidden cave beneath a towering cliff. The hooded alien stopped and turned to face the group. "Inside, you will be safe. The Ovox do not know of this place." The prisoners moved quickly into the cave, eager to rest. The Varen guided them deeper, revealing a hidden chamber filled with supplies, food, water, and even medical kits. David was impressed. "This is more than just a hideout. It's a supply cache." The Varen nodded. "It is a sanctuary for those fleeing the hunters." Lurvea looked around, her silver eyes filled with relief. "We may have a chance to survive." David sat down against a rock, finally letting himself breathe. For the first time, it felt like they had a real shot at escaping this nightmare. But deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Not yet.